I think one of the problems about not telling these kind of stories and letting other stories about Black leadership being sort of that lost cause story, the idea that Black leadership was inept. And I think that really still dominates the minds of a lot of people. Even today, I think a lot of academics don't think that. But I think for a lot of sort of lay people, everyday people, they think that. And that's part of the reason why I wrote this book, because the stories of people like Isaac Anderson and others, I think because those stories haven't been told, there is sort of a expectation that Blacks cannot be politically active and be capable political leaders, because those old stories of about Black ineptness have been maintained.
Thank you for watching another episode of the Jew 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jew 3 Project. And today I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Alicia Jackson. Welcome, Dr. Jackson.
Thank you. I appreciate being here, Lisa.
Thank you for joining us. For those who don't know you, just tell our audience just a little more about who you are.
Okay. Well, I am a historian. I focus primarily on African-American history and the South. And so I'm really interested in looking and recovering stories that have been lost or forgotten for various reasons. And so this project, The Recovered Life of Isaac Anderson, is well over a decades-long project to recover the story about a very important individual, but represents a lot of the stories that have not been told about African Americans for various reasons.
That's helpful. I'm excited to get to that today. You have a new book that kind of encompasses the work you've been working on, The Rediscovered Life of Isaac Anderson. For our audience, who is Isaac Anderson?
Well, Isaac Anderson was an African-American man. He was from Fort Valley area, which is it's like a little south of Macon. Anyway, he was owned by his father, who was a white slave owner. And anyway, he ended up working for his father, who was also involved in the slave trade. And so the story gets into talking a little bit about him, but also Isaac Anderson. And he's really significant in terms of looking at his story because he also is a founder of the CME Church, which was founded in 1870 as a colored Methodist church. So the story just looks at the relationship between this father and the son. Both of these men would serve in the Georgia legislature. The father would serve representing the area first, supporting the Democratic Party, which was very much aligned with the Ku Klux Klan. His father supported the ousting of Henry McNeil Turner and other Black legislators during Reconstruction. Eventually his father would be pushed out of the Georgia legislature, removed from the Georgia legislature because of his support of the Confederacy. And there were a concern about Georgia not passing the 15th Amendment because of his father's support for these sort of Klan-like policies. His son, who would initially run for office in 1868, would not win that election. His father did. And so his son then would run for his father's seat after his father was removed from office, and his son would win that office. But what his son did was use his political involvement through the church, because he's organizing the CME Church at the same time, and was able to help elect a whole slate of Republican candidates in Georgia. So his story rewrites a lot of the story about Georgia during this time by highlighting his life. He also, so Isaac Anderson would end up winning that election. And along with these other Republican candidates, by that time, Georgia is fully under Democratic control, again, aligned with the Ku Klux Klan. By that time, there's not a lot that Isaac Anderson can do. But one of the things he does is help lead Blacks out of Georgia. to relocate to Arkansas and North Mississippi because of those much better areas to live. And so eventually Isaac Anderson would relocate. In final days, he would relocate to Jackson, Tennessee, because he was one of the board of trustee members of Lane College and was a significant supporter of Lane College financially.
That's helpful to know. What got you interested in Isaac Anderson?
Well, I was working on my dissertation. And my dissertation focuses on the CME Church and looks at Mississippi Industrial College and in Holly Springs. And but focuses on the CME Church. And in the process of doing that, I ran into a descendant, or found some information from one of the descendants of Isaac Anderson. In the brochure that they put together, the family put together, they mentioned that Isaac Anderson had served in the Georgia legislature, and that he had been involved in helping the Black community in Georgia. And this was so contrary because most histories of the CME Church say that the CME Church was not involved in politics. And so my dissertation, but even larger in this project, demonstrate that you did have individuals involved in politics. So when I was going through, CME's involved in politics. So when I began to look through documents about Isaac Anderson, there was a vague reference to his father, William Jackson Anderson, but no reference to his mother. And I kept thinking, okay, so who is William Jackson Anderson? Again, this is the document the family had put together decades after his death. So I started looking, and with my historian hat, and got curious about what was going on. And this sort of fell into a rabbit hole and trying to find out more about the story, which ended up to be quite remarkable of a story. And like I said, it took me a very long time to put it all together.
Yeah, that is an incredible story. I'm sure he had some cognitive dissonance with his relationship with his father. I mean, I can't imagine how all that even played out back then and how that looked.
Well, yeah, but the thing that's interesting about that, and I think this is one of the things that one of the themes about the book is just sort of how complex relationships are. I think a lot of times, we can think, okay, things are very black and white. I mean, totally bad, totally good kind of thing. But one of the things that the family stressed with me in talking to Isaac Anderson's great granddaughter and other family members was that his father, even though his father was his master, voted on all these different policies that really, were harmful to Isaac Anderson and other members of the Black community. The story is that his father, before his father's death, he gave Isaac Anderson a tremendous amount of money. And that money allowed for Isaac Anderson to become a businessman in his own right, to sort of leave his ministerial work for a period of time, and then relocate to Jackson, Tennessee, where he would become a successful businessman. And so that's one of the things that's really interesting about this, is that there is sort of this, complicated story about these two men that you would think, it's just fraught with lots of complications.
Yeah. I guess at the end, his guilt got a hold of him to a degree, and he thought he would try to repair some of the damage he did by leaving his son that money.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because, there's a lot of question marks still remaining. I mean, I don't know. One of the things is that with all of this, there are no diaries. So, so recovering Isaac Anderson's life, there are pieces of the story I, put together. And because there are no diaries, so you don't quite know what exactly, is it the guilt? One of the things that's interesting is that in his father's obituary, there's a clear mention of Isaac Anderson in his father's obituary, and not necessarily a clear sort of, this is my son. But, you know, within those communities, oftentimes there were sort of open secrets. But he is referenced in his father's obituary. And so, yeah, you just wonder, what was their relationship like? And yeah, I'm sure fraught with lots of complications.
Yeah, that is very, very interesting. I'm sure we could spend a whole episode on that. What motivated Isaac Anderson to start CME?
Well, you know, I think one of the things that happened, and that's one of the things that's really interesting about the book, and sort of some of the things that I have sort of came across, is that, you know, oftentimes, you know, when and thinking about Georgia, or thinking about sort of the Black church, particularly in places like Georgia, people focusing on more on the AME and the AME Zion, and sort of think about sort of the Black community is monolithic, like
Mhm.
everybody just sort of, you know, sort of got along and just sort of, you know, went along with to work together. But one of the things that I think part of the reason why Isaac Anderson started or worked to start the CME Church is, I think for a period of time, there was a hope that he could work with the Southern Methodists, because again, the CMEs were an offshoot of the Southern Methodist Church, which of course split over the issue of slavery. And so what I think happened is, he is living during Reconstruction. And there are a lot of Blacks who have left, who've gone to the AME or AME Zion. Um, but then there are some Black folks who think, well, maybe we can maintain within the Southern Methodist sphere. And then as Reconstruction is taking place, as you have the rise of the apprenticeship system, where children, Black children, are being taken away from their parents, as you see the rise of the convict lease system, as you have all of this political violence going on, I think that is when Isaac Anderson said, okay, this is enough. So for a period of time, he actually was a part of the AME Church. And then he begins to see that there's some differences within the AME Church, in terms of just sort of philosophy and leadership and things like that. And so when the opportunity comes to start the CME Church, he, along with other Black Methodists, start the CME Church. And the thing about it is, and I think this gets into the reputation about the CME Church, there's always this reputation that the CMEs, especially early on, were like bootlick churches, where they just did whatever the Southern Methodists did. But they had to walk a really fine line in terms of getting the financial support they needed, but then having their own. So they're intentional about saying that they are the colored Methodist Episcopal, not South. They're intentional about saying they are a all Black denomination of their own, in line of the original Methodist Episcopal Church. So they're clear about that. So it's really interesting, because they have to walk this negotiating line, which I think, you know, I think a lot of, you know, African American Black people today understand that line of negotiating, especially when you're in hostile spaces, until you get a period of time when you can have that autonomy. And eventually the CMEs would have that autonomy and become very vocal, particularly in politics and other issues as well.
Mhm. When you talk about them needing autonomy and walking that fine line, um, was it them still needing financial support from white Methodists, and that's why they had to toe that line?
Yes.
Um, Outside of that?
Yeah, and the thing about the CMEs, and this is to help you understand how well, and help listeners and viewers as well, the CMEs are primarily rural based. So they are a rural based denomination, as opposed to like AME and AME Zion typically are more urban based denominations. And not to say all of them, but that's one of the hallmarks of the CMEs. And so yeah, they went, and also to AME and AME Zion were very critical of the CMEs, because one of the things that happens with the CMEs is because they end up getting property from the Southern Methodists. So that sort of makes it a little bit more where it's complicated. Sort of there's tensions with among Black Methodists, but because the CMEs are primarily rural based, and the African American community is really, moving forward out of enslavement, economically things are really challenging. Again, this is the time when you have the rise of the convict lease system and sharecropping and things like that. So yeah, that's part of that fine line they had to negotiate in terms of making sure that it's almost like that double consciousness where you say one thing in one community, the white community, you say one thing, but within the Black community, you're doing something totally different. And so I think that is part of the reason why the work and this look at the CMEs and what's going on in this rural-based denomination is really important. And I will say this, add one other thing on. There's been some work done on sort of the rural Black community and how, that is in the rural Black community in the South, especially following the Civil War, early 1900s. This is the base of where you're going to see the rise of things like Garveyism are going to be based in rural communities. And I would argue that there is this sort of this is going on, and this is a part of what you see with the CME Church, is that you see that there are people who are very much interested in Black autonomy and independence. And one of the ways you see that outworking is going to be later on when you see the rise of the Garvey movement in the rural South.
That's helpful. Can you share a little bit more about the Garvey movement in the rural South? Because I don't think a lot of people know about that and its impact and
Yeah.
how that might have affected the formation of CME.
Yeah, so you have the rise of Garveyism. Of course, Marcus Garvey, it comes to the United States. By 1919, you have the establishment of the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association. And so one of the things, I think her name is Mary Rawlinson, wrote a book a couple years ago looking at Garveyism and looking at it especially primarily in the South. And one of the things that she argues is that this sense of sort of Black nationalism that's very much a part of the Garvey movement. You can see it in urban areas of the South, but you can also see it definitely in rural parts of the South. And so I think sometimes when there's been such a focus in on sort of more urban aspects of African American history and sort of thinking about the South in that context, sometimes I think there's sort of an overlooking of the rural sort of movement that you have. And so Mary Rawlinson in her book talks about that you have within these rural communities, again, a proliferation of UNIA chapters in the South. So my tied ends with Isaac Anderson is just that I think that there is within the framework of the Black community, I think there's, especially in rural parts of the South, there is this there's a challenging of the system that's going on. There is not sort of acquiescing to what's going on. I think there is a vibrant Black movement to challenge the system.
Mm-hmm. You have 2 dates in your table of contents, 1868 and 1870, that you for your book decided that they needed to be chapter titles because you felt the date was the time was so distinct. What were the significant things that happened in those 2 time frames that you felt were so significant that your readers needed to pay attention to?
Yeah, so 1868 was the year that Georgia was finishing up its constitutional convention. Isaac Anderson served in the constitutional convention, which the writing of the Georgia Constitution had to be approved by voters. And so anyway, but that was done in 1868. The voting of the Constitution. You also had the election to public office of your, local officials, but also the governor and state offices as well. And so 1868 also would be an important year because of the fact that that's when you see really the rise of the Ku Klux Klan as well. So those all coalesce And that's going to be the year when Isaac Anderson and his father, William Jackson Anderson, both run for office. His father would run to serve in the Georgia Senate in 1868, and Isaac Anderson would run to serve in the Georgia House of Representatives. So that's why I picked that date as a significant date. In 1870, I picked that as a date because of the fact that that's when you have the founding of the CME Church. So you have the founding of the CME Church, which in their founding, and I should have probably said this earlier, one of the things that they are founded on is the idea that they would not be political. And part of the reason why you have that, I think, is because of the fact that there were white individuals in the white Southern Methodists in the audience. Isaac Anderson's very vocal in that he believes that Black people should be able to be political and that should be involved in their churches as well, being in politics. And so 4 days later, he wins a seat in the Georgia legislature in 1870. So that's why I picked that year, because it is the year that you have the founding of the CME Church, but also it's the year that Isaac Anderson is elected to serve in the Georgia legislature. And he is not thrown out by the CMEs, nor do the Southern Methodists make a big deal about that, because there's just the political concern about CME leaders like Isaac Anderson leaving, maybe leaving the denomination and maybe going back and joining the AME or AME Zion.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting how politics and church politics were at play in that, and almost like you said, the message, creating two different messages to do two different audiences to try to accomplish the goals. So to try to pacify the white audience and the Black audience at the same time to further the mission. I guess kind of like what we would call modern day code switching on a different level.
Oh, most definitely. Most definitely. I think you definitely have that going on. And I think that's part of the reason why it's such an interesting book, because I don't think that code switching that you see that there's a part of the CME story. I don't think historians have really tapped into that and really understood that before. I think that they focus in on this one particular CME leader, Lucius Hoseley. He would be a bishop who's very vocal in his support of the Southern Methodists, and a lot of things he says are very troubling in terms of the CMEs sort of going along with what the Southern Methodists want them to do, and that they're going to be out of politics. But that is one voice that you hear. And my argument is that within the CMEs, there are a larger voice of people who are challenging what's going on. But historically, people have just sort of focused on what Hoseley said and not looked at what Isaac Anderson said and what he did and other Black leaders did in terms of that code switching back and forth. Yeah.
So CME and AME Zion, for those who are listening, they may be a little bit confused because there's like African Methodist Episcopal, colored Methodist. What are the fundamental distinctions outside of politics?
Okay, yeah, sure. So you have the AMEs are established in the 1790s, and of course, the founding bishop would be Bishop Richard Allen, and that's centered in Philadelphia. Then you have the AME Zion, and that's centered more in New York. Almost the same time that you have the founding of the AME, you have the founding of the AME Zion, but that's centered in New York, New Jersey. Probably one of the most prominent individuals who would be tied to AME Zion would be Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. AME Zion would be a part of the AME Zion church. So they have a direct connection to the early, sort of the first Methodist Episcopal Church. sort of early founding, but again, they would be founded in the 1790s is when you see the founding of the AME and AME Zion. And the CMEs are founded much later. They're founded in 1870, and they're founded by the Southern Methodists, because of course, right before slavery, you had pretty much all mainline denominations split over the issue of slavery. And so you're going to see by the 1850s, you're going to see the creation of the Methodist Episcopal Church, which is housed in the north, and then Methodist Episcopal Church South, which is the southern branch of the denomination. And they split. And so the CMEs are started in 1870 as an offshoot of the Southern Methodists.
Mm-hmm. Were there any, I guess, one of the criticisms of AME in the past has been their high emphasis on education, especially in the pulpit. Did the CME have I don't want to say a lower bar, but they weren't as restrictive as AME as far as ordination?
Yeah, they were pretty strict on ordination. The CMEs were. And one of the things that they do at their founding meeting is that they require that they make a requirement that you do need to be able to read. And right. So that's a part of their stipulation that they put in there. So they're pretty stringent about that. And I think a lot of that has to do because of the circle, the spaces that they're in, and the fact that that you have that the Southern Methodist Church had questioned the AME Church, and this is in the about 1867, late 1860s, I guess I should say. The Southern Methodists had questioned the AMEs, particularly in Georgia, because there were some individuals who were being ordained who were not educated. And so I think because of that, the CMEs were really sort of pretty adamant about making sure that people in that who are ordained were literate. So yeah, they definitely emphasize that.
That's helpful to know. Is there anything else about Isaac Anderson that you want our audience to know that you think is very important for them?
Yeah,
as it relates to him?
yeah. Well, I think that, I mean, it's ultimately the book is a micro history of just sort of telling the Black story in the South, and one that again has not been really shared or told. And so I think some of the themes that are about the book, whether it be Reconstruction and Black involvement in politics, and how that coincides with the relationship with the church, I think those are some really big themes. And as someone who lives in Georgia, this has been really significant, because I think one of the problems about not telling these kind of stories and letting other stories about Black leadership being sort of that lost cause story, the idea that Black leadership was inept. And I think that really still dominates the minds of a lot of people. Even today, I think a lot of academics don't think that. But I think for a lot of sort of lay people, everyday people, they think that. And that's part of the reason why I wrote this book, because of the fact that what you see in the public libraries typically kind of a lot of times continue that story. So, there's a reason why Isaac Anderson would be the last African American, or one of two last African Americans. That would be 1874. He would be the last state senator. The next one to be elected would not be until to serve in the Georgia legislature, in the Georgia Senate, would not be until the 1960s. There's a reason why you have there have only been, I think, 6 African Americans in the entire history of Georgia to ever serve in a statewide office, because the stories of people like Isaac Anderson have been, and others. I mean, I think he's sort of a micro history of a broader history of Black political involvement in Georgia and in the South. I think because those stories haven't been told, there is sort of a expectation that Blacks cannot be politically active and be capable political leaders, because those old stories about Black ineptness have been maintained. So I think that would be one of the main things I would say is I think that this is a huge corrective on the idea about Black leadership, and then also too, one of the things I get into talking about the book is talking about how the church played a role in healing of trauma. Talk about
Mm.
trauma theory and how it relates to that, and how the Black church served as a place of healing and just sort of and then when that didn't work, how you have Black ministers, not only Isaac Anderson, but others who, when the refuge of the church was not enough, gathered their people up and found ways to relocate them into other safe spaces where you had majority Black or all Black communities, so that they could have a place of refuge. So I think, I mean, those are two of a number of themes of the book that I think would be really relevant to our readers. I mean, that's to your listeners and watchers, because I mean, I think that's why Black people are a lot of folks are moving back or trying to find all Black communities. That happened a couple of months ago in just south of Atlanta. You had a community founded there, or Charles Blow's recent book talking about the book The Devil You Know, arguing about Black people relocating to the South so they can have political power. I think that is a long sort of strand that runs through history, that I think Isaac Anderson's story really emphasizes.
That's helpful, especially when you talk about the church being a place of trauma healing,
Mhm.
because now, many millennials, Gen Z may say the church caused them trauma.
Mm.
So to see people in that time saying the church was a healing space where they were able to be a safe space from the traumatic experience they were enduring outside in the world is very interesting and fascinating. And also that pastors, when the church wasn't enough, was able to send people out to places they might think would be uh, healthy for them, shows that sometimes we're not thinking about the full history or scope. We might be just thinking about our individual experiences. And while those individual experiences may be traumatic, one thing trauma does is often blinds you to the world outside of just your own individual world. And so I think to bring that to the audience, I think it's really good and fascinating. So thank you so much, Dr. Jackson, for all the work you put into this. 10 years is a long time, and I know that many will be blessed. You said what now?
Oh, I just know. I thought yeah, I just laughed when you said 10 years. It's like, yes, yeah. I mean, it was a great. I mean, but I love researching, and I
Mhm.
got to meet a lot of neat people, and took my children to probably places they like we went to cemeteries, to walk through cemeteries to look for people, or their grave sites, and I got to research at a former prison, and I was the only one in there, and it was kind of a little creepy, but anyway, so it was a challenge, but it was well worth it, and I think it's just such an important story to tell, because I think I would say one of the things that I think a number of other folks are, I don't want to hear about necessarily what white people did, and what they did and how they responded to things, and I want to hear what did Black people do? How
Mhm.
did they survive? How did they manage? And in many cases thrive, and negotiate some very hard places. I think the other thing about the book is, that I talk about, is telling stories and the connecting with our past. And so I think when we don't tell these stories, we lose so much. And oftentimes we're so busy and this and that going on, that we have a disconnect with our ancestors in that
Mhm.
way. And so when we can reclaim these stories, I think it helps us to be able to move forward, have perseverance. And so again, I think another value of his story and book.
Well, thank you so much. The book drops. It's not out yet.
No, it'll be out December 15th, but it
Okay.
can be pre-ordered.
Okay.
University Press of Mississippi is publishing it, so it will be available in December. December 15th.
Awesome. And they can pre-order it on Amazon?
Yes, and also they at the University Press of Mississippi as well as it's available. Mhm.
Okay. Do you have any social media handles?
Primarily right now, I'm on LinkedIn. That's
Okay.
about it right now. But yeah.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jackson. It has been such a rich conversation. Thank you all for watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project. You can catch all our past episodes, jude3project.org. Remember, Courageous Conversations is coming up soon. We are sold out of all in-person tickets, but you can definitely register for virtual admission at courageousconvos.org. Remember, this will not be live streamed, so if you want to view it, you have to get a virtual ticket. Remember, you could get our curriculum here through Eyes of Color, take an online course, get merch, and become a monthly partner, all at jude3project.org. Remember, here at the Jude 3 Project, we're helping you to know what you believe and why you believe it. Until next time, grace and peace, and God bless.